Greetings. In the learning versus acquisition view debate, I definitely side with the acquisition view. And that is something that I think I've already expressed has evolved for me over my 20 years of teaching. I was definitely trained in and began with a learning view, but I really related to and have come to see what Krashen describes as the natural order hypothesis, where they're given a natural approach of giving students comprehensible input, language they can understand and that is meaningful to them. We will see stages of language development happen naturally. One, and I've seen this with my own children learning their first language and with my students learning their second, that there is that silent stage. They use gestures, but they're still communicating. And we can have a back and forth communication as such. Happens in my classroom as well. And I give my students gestures to help them feel comfortable and able to communicate in some ways, and so that I know they are comprehending oral input. Then they move on to that early production stage where they can create words and phrases, on to speech emergence where those phrases become more complicated and some simple sentences develop, and then eventually, and for Spanish anyway, it doesn't tend to be till the end of the year into 8th grade in Spanish 1 for novice students that they go into that intermediate fluency where they're able to create complex sentences and use joiner words and have compound sentences, but that fluency does build naturally. So to point out where I've seen that happen in my classroom, I'm going to go to the things that I expect my students to be able to demonstrate. One being reading comprehension, one way that they acquire language, the biggest way really, besides oral input that they get in class during class time. So when I taught traditionally with textbooks, those readings focused on kind of canned dialogues that just had all this grammar and very specific vocabulary sprinkled throughout. It wasn't particularly interesting, along with cultural stories that were frankly not very culturally or racially diverse and often outdated. None of them were very interesting to my students, and I didn't see them excited to read, or that they even got much input from that type of reading. When I switched to comprehensible input, giving the students stories that they could understand at their level, a little above their level really, and that was meaningful to them, the engagement level went up, as did, I believe, the language they acquired. So we often will focus on interesting cultural topics like the human towers, the castels, or Tio Nadal, the pooping log, and Christmas tradition in Spain, that the students, get kind of excited about and intrigued, and we can have conversations where I can ask them personal questions about how they celebrate, or is this like anything you've ever seen? Would you like to go there? And it creates, again, this ability to then go on to conversational language development. And also we create a lot of stories together that they then can read similar versions of, and we can read aloud together, or I can have guided readings where I talk them through as they read along on their own. And then, as talked about in the video, there's this gradual release of responsibility where they then can go on to partner reading, individual reading, but it is simple and comprehensible. I do a lot of embedded reading, so they start reading first week of school, 2-3 sentences, impressed with themselves, and then I can add in additional input to that same structured story as it builds and builds, and suddenly they're now reading a page, but they're able to comprehend because it's done slowly. And I never found when I gave them the rules first, as the Climber study said, there were just too many of them, and I didn't see the output that I wanted as a result. From the reading comprehension and the oral communication, they then can eventually move on to their own writing acquisition. And in the novice classes, I've seen, because they get this input they understand, their own desire to take those stories we create together and create their own version, or write a new ending. And the next day they'll come in, Profe, did you read my story? Did you like the ending? They're very excited about it. But as was mentioned in the text and that Reed study from the 70s, they invent the spelling. Frequently in the beginning, a lot of it is invented. But because I know their first language and the way their mind is thinking phonetically, I can still comprehend the story. And I notice that as they get more input, orally, through reading comprehension, that spelling improves little by little, slowly. And so I can see that the graphonic knowledge change through their writing, especially. And eventually they then get around to being confident with speaking. But that is definitely the last thing they seem to build. And with the comprehensible input and that natural order hypothesis, it takes some of the pressure off, the stress, if they're not expected to. In my traditional teaching, I had to grade them on speaking every single unit, and it was frankly stressful for the kids and stressful for me, because it didn't seem like the best way to teach, frankly. But when I allow that natural approach to develop as it should, the kids on their own want to participate. They build confidence that when the material is meaningful and it's personal question and answers or card talk where they draw me a picture and we talk about where they went this weekend, they want to share. And as Chomsky talks about, there's a social piece that's needed too for them to want to engage. And when I allow that to happen in class, I see that they're not so worried about the pronunciation because they just really want to tell their story. And in order to work and for me to really hear the pronunciation, especially for those kids that are more nervous to share, then I will use tongue twisters or simple songs, dichos, sayings, right? That traditional sayings that allow, and we can do it as a whole group so that they don't feel like they're being called out. And I can do the walk around and still hear their pronunciation, and that gives me some formative assessment idea of where they need more input and how I can build that into the oral communication they receive and the reading comprehension, the readings that I give them in class. So I really have found a strong connection to a lot of what they talked about in chapter 5 of our text, and when it comes to the acquisition view and the learning of language.